Thank you, kind brothers. If anything occurs to me during the next half hour or so that I'm talking about being your bishop, I shall change course, and you're forewarned. We're bringing things to a close. This is our last session, and it's been a delight to learn from my colleagues. I've had a difficult time over at home for some reason, so I didn't catch all of Sam's talk, but it sounded predictably like he was flying high, and I'm sorry to miss that. I'll catch up with him. At the end of the last century, Dolly was born, the world's most famous sheep. She had 3 mothers. One provided the egg, another the DNA, and a third carried the cloned embryo to term. She had 3 fathers, too, if one counts the 2 Scottish scientists overseeing the cloning process. Dolly was not the first, but she was the first mammal cloned from a single adult somatic cell using a process of nuclear transfer. A half-century earlier, an American B-29 bomber dropped the world's first deployed atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The explosion annihilated 90% of the city, killing 80,000 people promptly, leaving tens of thousands of others to wilt more slowly from radiation. These 2 events incited triumph and horror among different constituencies. Those who were paying attention theologically noticed that the processes formerly assumed to be strictly the domain of God were not. Human beings are capable of their own accord by artificial means of engendering and altering life. Human beings are capable of destroying creation. Prior to his execution, 4 months before Hiroshima, the German pastor and theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer resided for 2 years in prison at Tegel and then the concentration camp at Flossenburg, hosted by the Nazi regime. Prison can be a clarifying experience for certain souls. In the jaws of the legalized evil, mandated evil, Bonhoeffer contemplated the state of the world that had been incubating for some time. He wrote cheerfully, optimistically to his fiancée and his parents. Things are good, hoping to be out by Christmas. But letters to his friend Eberhard Bethke, since published, were somber, penetrating, and presumably informed by his setting. Science, among other human affairs, was, he mused, increasingly filling the gaps for people, seeming to address their unanswered questions and problems. In law and politics and other spheres of life also, God was increasingly viewed as less and less relevant. Rather than simply resist such an evolution towards greater human autonomy as the religious establishment did around him, Bonhoeffer reflected thus: so where is any room left for God? Ask those who are anxious. We cannot be honest unless we recognize that we have to live in the world as though there were no God. God would have us know that we must live as those who manage our lives without God. Before God and with God, we live without God. Bonhoeffer's most mature theological reflections are his least polished and complete, fragments and scraps, jottings and sometimes full letters, while in prison, optimism drained about ever being released. These shards leave Bonhoeffer subject to conflicting speculative interpretations. People have taken Bonhoeffer in many different directions. In a land where a genocidal mafia controls the state, is this incarcerated and doomed Bonhoeffer identifying with the impaled Christ who asks, "Why hast thou forsaken me?" Or is Bonhoeffer a man gone further yet, who is beginning to realize he isn't going to escape, and that the God he hoped would come to his aid is off duty? Was he indeed real? Or when Bonhoeffer scribbles of a world come of age, is he the embryo of Charles Taylor? When he writes of the need for a religionless Christianity, is he grappling with an institution, one that he served, but now found inadequate to the modern world, the mere cloak of revelation, as he put it? Or is it that Christianity needs much more radically to suffuse life, to dissolve the distinction from the secular, to be de-thingified? It's a little like the invention of art that at some point became less an expression of self and quest for meaning, an aesthetic encounter, and became more like, there's a wall, let's hang something on it. A religionless Christianity. It is precisely this ambiguity in understanding Bonhoeffer that induces me to choose him as a reference point. For the past 2 days, we have spoken in the shadow of Charles Taylor and others. Quibbles or more serious critiques of Taylor have been proffered. Despite his ambiguity, Bonhoeffer suggests that something was going on in the mid-20th century. Thinkers were beginning to grapple with some historical and religious paradigm shift. Whether or not they have come to terms with the shifting ground engenders questions. To the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, to choose an entirely random example, should the church in a secular age continue to tell its story in terms of a question that preoccupied its founder when he was a teenage boy in antebellum America? Many in his time and place in the rapidly disestablishing young republic asked, which church is true? And this query drove the nascent prophet to the woods. But the 21st century asks a different question. Not which church is true, but why church? Why religion? The 21st century may ask altered questions of us individuals too. How shall we live in our era? Answers have been implicit and sometimes explicit in our presentations throughout the conference. My homework assignment, given to me by my overlords, Sam and Miranda and Jim, ask me to, within the traditions of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but also in relation to the secular age, consider human perfection. I'm conscious that people want to experience such virtue, as we might approximate with the term perfection. People want to experience virtue, or at least they want to witness it in action rather than to hear some dude talk about it. If it must be verbalized, they would like to hear words from Mother Teresa or an apostle rather than the likes of me. I thought when I was writing that paragraph of Immanuel Kant, whom one time I heard a scholar observe of Kant, that his thought was so profound that he would have been the greatest human ever to live, if only he had known how to love. So I am not the paragon here. I am here to, as with the rest of my colleagues on the conference, see if we could think through some intellectual building blocks for persons who are better than I to take account of as they go about pursuing virtue. Is it the case that particular human beings, such as Catholic saints or LDS general authorities, might be seen as exemplary in an age grown distrustful and even resentful, not only of institutions like Congress or the presidency or police forces or banks or churches, but also hagiographic narratives and projected heroes, too many of whom have been unmasked as fallen? Where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio? A nation turns its lonely eyes to you. Now, the problem with perfection is that it has to be imagined. Lowell Bennion, a kind of Latter-day Saint Mother Teresa of the second half of the 20th century and homespun philosopher to boot, said, we live in two worlds. The first is the exterior, objective world of reality, if such exists. Everything out there, humans, their institutions, history, nature, God, the cosmos, whatever's beyond what we know. The second world we live in is interior, a subjective world through which lens I engage the outer objective world and in which I inherit and fashion my values. In relation to the infinite outer world, we are each minuscule, negligible. In the inner world of values and my enactment of them, I have a say. I can help fashion a universe, the interior subjective one in which I live. Perhaps I seek excellence, even the consummation of excellence that we will call perfection. Latter-day Saints regularly remind themselves to do their best and not to be too hard on themselves. They do this because an unhealthy mutation to perfectionism can arise in our morally earnest culture. This may produce self-righteousness or ostentation on the one hand, or on the other, depression and anxiety. In extreme cases, it can produce an obsessive-compulsive disorder, colloquially called among psychologists and psychiatrists scrupulosity, as for instance when two mission president friends of mine have reported they had certain elders or sisters who would come and confess and repent, which he thought was lovely the first 3 times it happened, but it kept happening all the time with every little peccadillo that they performed. The sources of LDS notions of perfection include Scripture. What manner of men, of person, ought ye to be, even as I am? Or more famously and centrally, Matthew's rendition of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Be, therefore, perfect. And lest there be any ambiguity about what that meant, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. Gulp. A second source is Joseph Smith's teachings of theosis, admonitions to take 2 Peter seriously and in a particular way, to be partakers of the divine nature. A third source of LDS notions of perfection is the mandate to perfect the saints, perfecting the saints, known to our recent generation as part of the 3 and now 4-fold mission of the church. So let me make clear that I'm not talking here about common understandings of perfection among the saints, which sometimes incline to the concept of becoming flawless, becoming sinless. I'm talking about another meaning of perfection that I think is more apt, and that is something like the meaning of the word telos in the New Testament, be therefore the root word there is telos, suggesting in Koine Greek fullness, the end, the goal. Be what you're supposed to be like your Father in heaven is. Become. Be be complete, be the end for which you were created. What this wholeness, this consummation of excellence looks like is necessarily imagined, and it is imagined in a community, even if one is a hermit, one inherited, one wasn't born in isolation, inherits thought patterns as well as the capacity to reflect on them. So what perfection looks like operates within some system, of course, of understanding, some notion of what life is for, what is valuable. For a sampling of group notions of what members of the church as a whole may think, and of the church, by the church, in this context, I mean the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. For a sampling of group notions about what members might imagine the prime traits of admirable people to be, I got out the Encyclopedia of Mormonism, and I looked at all the virtues that are listed there. This is a semi-correlated, approved work. The topics covered were admirable ones, but they seemed somewhat arbitrary to me in relation to potential candidates that were left out. Are we glimpsing something of our corporate unconscious when we observe that virtues like obedience, humility, mercy, enduring to the end, and thankfulness have independent status in our encyclopedia, while equally important virtues like integrity, not merely honesty, which does get treatment, but integratedness, integrity, or creativity, or courage, which have no entry in the encyclopedia. What do you reckon would be Nietzsche's assessment of the list of virtues in the Mormon Encyclopedia? Nietzsche's whose own aspirations centered on the self, on its will to power, on strength, on authenticity, which is not a neutral term, as Sam just pointed out. Nietzsche, who critiqued Christianity's values, mercy, turn the other cheek, agape, forms of love, as what Nietzsche called the effeminate virtues. He lived before 1970. A different way to look at this would be to call on Ben Franklin, whose famous autobiography became a tract for the new American person. It might have been better titled, instead of his biography or the biography, it might have been better titled The Art of Virtue, for he was explicitly conscious of setting an example for the new nation he had helped to fashion. Franklin was no atheist like Nietzsche, but his God was more remote by far than garden variety deists. Tongue-in-cheek or no, the God he proposed for worship was the God above the God, above the God, above the God, above the God who created this world. What's missing here from this secular theists, sort of, but secularists' moral perfection? Many of you would have encountered Franklin's autobiography. If not, you may be a secular saint, but you're not an American. So go read Franklin's autobiography. Here's his list. Don't get too lost in his definitions, although I'll point out that they are, in fact, relevant. And they seem like admirable things, although Franklin points out himself that he added the last one a little, okay, I guess I'll add humility, because a couple of acquaintances had accused him as wanting in that regard. So there's 12 virtues and an appendix called humility. Chastity has an interesting definition, I thought, and sincerity has an interesting definition, I think. So these are not neutral terms, but what's missing here? If we had time to be more interactive, we will, after I talk for a few more minutes, we could exchange about that. But you'll notice that Unlike Lowell Benion's hierarchy of values that he wrote in his little skinny book, The Things That Matter Most, the word faith isn't there, or sacrifice, or charity, or compassion, or kindness, or gratitude, or selflessness, or others we could name. It is what people actually do that discloses more than lists of virtues on paper or on their lips, of course. But these sorts of maps do tell us something about the aspirational maps etched in the heads of our potential exemplars. If we had time, it would be instructive maybe. Oh, I was going to show you one more that, if you've read the autobiography, is familiar to you, and that's a chart of, I think it was the first virtue, was temperance, the first virtue that Franklin was attempting to achieve perfection in this one virtue. And every time, let's see, now I've forgotten. Stephen, where's Stephen? Is this the marks when he blew it, or he did good?
I'm not sure.
I've forgotten which is which. We'll just, there's two marks there on one, so I think it's when he construes that he messed up once during the day, and so he marks thus. Whoops, those got out of order. Oh no, I think I just forgot to have you put that on there. I was going to show you personal progress charts, Latter-day Saint personal progress charts that have echoes of this, and they have different traits listed, but we found one in Stephen Betts, who's my one of my research assistants and my conversation partner, helping me think through some of what's coming to you today, pointed out to me that these exist by the dozens and dozens and dozens online, some officially by the church, many by aspiring saints seeking their own moral improvement or ultimately maybe perfection. Many Latter-day Saints look to general authorities of the church as their exemplars. The most general of general authorities are the church's apostles, 15 men, 12 in the quorum of 12 apostles and 3 members of the first presidency, whom believers honor as prophets. They have a daunting load to manage while leading a lay church sprawled across continents in a surging, changing, contested world. Within the wider sea of church members, there exist streams that together form a bipolar attitude towards these leaders. On one hand, like biblical prophets, these modern prophets often feel unheeded. Like biblical prophets, therefore, though in different form, they issue recurrent injunctions to follow the brethren. On the other hand, and more to our purposes today, they make no claim to infallibility and no claim to be paragons. But many church members haven't gotten the memo. There is a problem in a substrata among the church, a kind of a creeping infallibility, a lens that imagines the leaders. We know you say you make mistakes and you're humble, but that just proves how perfect you are, unconsciously sort of a read. This puts our leaders in rather a tough position. We're prophets, follow the brethren. On the one hand, we're only human. We make mistakes. Sometimes we change course across history. Sometimes we correct what we think were mistakes in times past. That's a bit of attention, and this creeping perception of de facto infallibility and moral excellence bears risks. Among them is one that we have a long tradition of hagiographic biography and hagiographic history. And two, this tradition of hagiography can fuel or prompt a crisis of faith among those given over to it when flaws in our forebears or our leaders, past or present, are disclosed. For loyal disciples, there are also obvious risks on the opposite side in not taking prophetic counsel seriously and breaking allegiance with them. I have 7 suggestions for navigating this tension. How reliable are prophets? Has there ever been a prophet who said something in the name of the Lord that seems a little dubious across history? The issue is one, and it bothers a great many people. We know by surveys and personal experience that it bothers a number of people. Personal experience, like in my line of work, a lot of people come and talk in my office. I have 7 suggestions for navigating this tension. First of all, this doesn't count, this is 0. There's nothing too wicked or upsetting about tension. Tensions hold molecules and solar systems together, so that's okay, but they have to be navigated. And for you secular people in this room, believers nonetheless, are not with me on that magical number of 7, then get with it. This is like the 7 habits of highly effective disciples. First, W.B. Yeats seemed to think that personality and perfect character were mutually exclusive modes of being. You could not be possessed of both at one time. This notion may beset followers of general authorities who know our leaders only through televised sessions of General Conference or with their picture next to an article in the Ensign. I advise against going all the way with Yeats's conclusion. We only see our church leaders in church uniforms, apostolic dignity of their office, public presentations, mistaking a certain sameness in their presentations as though Yeats were right and that to achieve perfection means to be homogenated into some perfect something that other perfect creatures are becoming, seems rather to me a misconception. 2, hagiography need not be a dirty word, as it often is to historians, for instance. Philosopher Edith Wiskogord, in a book called Saints and Postmodernism, observes, neither saintly practice nor saintly power is, for the most part, transmitted in standard normative discourse. Saintly communications can also be understood as non-verbal pedagogy, philosophy of teaching. Borrowing an image from Wittgenstein, she continues, seeing the meaning of saintly work is less like grasping an argument and more like understanding a musical theme. Virtue is more powerfully shown than told. But Wiskograd is keen to argue that hagiography must retain honesty and accuracy or authenticity. Too often in our tradition, hagiography has meant airbrushed history and airbrushed biography. This bears the fraught freight. I gave work to that phrase. This bears the fraught freight of distortion and obscurantism or incompetence. It bears the freight of lacking suasion to thoughtful minds, of leaving others feeling betrayed when they later encounter more informed and forthcoming history, of tainting the entire genre of hagiography, and the temptation to shoot the messenger when some poor scholar crafts a responsible account of the past. Inauthentic hagiography entails the further problem of misdirecting the locus of our attention in search of virtue from its proper ends, or from its proper location, rather. The real virtues we seek are forged in the very face of our genuine selves, navigating real ambiguity and real challenge. I am happy to observe that the Church, especially its historical department, is making decided progress in the caliber of its hagiographic effort. Maybe I'll get rid of that distraction for a minute. Third, power is a peculiar thing. It has traits. It produces dynamics. These dynamics need to be taken into account in human dealings more than sometimes they are. Power may be vested in one's gender, class, or race, of course, as academics are perpetually exploring these days. Or the power may display itself in the smartest person in the room, or the strongest, or the wealthiest, most beautiful, or charismatic, or well-connected, the most famous, or the most eloquent, or the one possessed of the highest institutional authority in either ecclesiastical or secular settings. There are psychological and social dynamics at play when being or being in the company of such a person of power. When one is possessed of one of these forms of power, these potential goods, one may have to adjust for these dynamics. The currents are strong, and one may walk slant into the room of others. It requires discipline for a slant person to walk straight. The words discipline and disciple share etymological DNA. Joseph Smith offers a now canonized instance of one characteristic of one form of power. In 1839, as he pondered for months while incarcerated in the endearingly named Liberty Jail in Missouri, he wrote, "We have learned by sad experience that it is the nature and disposition," I guess now I want that up. We'll come to that. It's the nature and disposition of, and this is bracing, almost all men, as soon as they get a little authority, as they suppose, they will immediately begin to exercise unrighteous dominion. Unrighteous dominion has 1,000 faces, and Joseph goes on to say, this is a problem. He teaches that the rights of the priesthood are inseparably connected with the powers of heaven, and that the powers of heaven cannot be controlled nor handled only upon the principles of righteousness. No power, this is very familiar language to Latter-day Saints, so hold on to your wallets, because familiarity is the opiate of the people. No power or influence can or ought be maintained by virtue of the priesthood, only by persuasion, long-suffering, gentleness, meekness, and love, not its appearance. By kindness and pure knowledge, which shall greatly enlarge the soul, without hypocrisy and without guile. Fourth out of 7 points in navigating the tension. It is wise to distinguish between the authority and potential inspiration of a leader on one hand, and on the other hand, his perceived role as a moral paragon. These are generally good people called to high office, given high responsibilities and the authority to execute them, including believers hold the right to inspiration and revelation. But public perceptions of this latter role as exemplars have a history, and the way that these exemplars are thought of now is not the way they've always been perceived in the church. This isn't the place to attempt to account for the entire history, but, for example, Brigham Young was amused by the near adoration given early Mormon leaders, grown old like himself or Parley Pratt, by members of a growing church, who felt that should they come into the presence of the famed leaders, they would have to pull off their shoes, as the ground would be so holy upon which they trod. So also Joseph Smith, who publicly said 1 year prior to his death, "I don't think there's a great many very good people, very good men since Adam. There was one good man, Jesus. Many wrongly think a prophet must be a great deal better than anybody else. Suppose I would posture condescend to be a great deal better than any of you. I would then be raised up to the highest heaven, and who should I have to accompany me there? I love that man better who swears a stream as long as my arm and administers to the poor and divides his substance with them, rather than the long, smooth-faced hypocrites. I don't want you to think I am very righteous, for I am not very righteous. In light of such observations, it would be prudent, I think, if we were to notice that the church is made up entirely of human beings, from first to last, and these human beings are trying to respond to the divine with which they have been touched. From Joseph Smith on, this is a simple sounding formula, but it's not the map that's in everybody's head. From Joseph Smith on, the church is made up entirely of human beings, with everything, please, that implies, who are trying to respond to the divine with which they have, in faith, been touched. Fifth, to any church member who inquired of me, I might recommend establishing confidence in relation to church leaders. This is not merely to place confidence in leaders whose persons and office I honor, but as I appropriate the term confidence, the fid refers to trust, faith, like Fido the dog. I fancy, before we became secular, that all our sons who are not named John were named Christian or Samuel, the last syllable referring to God, and all our daughters were named Christine or Mary after the mother of Christ, or Grace or Charity or Prudence, and all our dogs were named Fido. But this would be a digression. The fid in confidence is trust, and the con suggests with. I do not merely place confidence in church leaders, whether local or general, but I seek to establish confidence with them, a relationship, a two-way street. Church members sustain leaders in their calling as distinctively commissioned and authorized stewards, as indeed prophets. But the confidence, I urge, implies acting out of faith and trust together. It applies equally to church leaders and to those who sustain them. Sixth, aspiring saints ought not forget to follow the prophets, but they should follow these prophets to Christ. There's a Rorschach problem here too, because like perfection, Christ has to be imagined. The scriptures are not Christ. The temple ceremony is not Christ. They are portraits of Christ. They are aids. We have to somehow engage them. Nevertheless, we should follow the brethren to Christ. Seventh, others, Jim Faulkner in particular, have called on N.T. Wright this weekend and his epistemology of love, which allows us to be led to Christ by loving understanding of others. He cited Wright's different principles of what an epistemology of love consists of. I'll say them briefly to remind you. Knowing includes not just our heads. We humans are not just brains in a jar on the table. Knowing includes all aspects of being human, including love, as opposed to the romantics, who were too interior for Wright, and the rationalists, who are too cerebral. Knowing takes place in community. Knowing is situated, not detached. I would suggest that Wright's epistemology of love be marshaled when we attend to our human leaders as much as to our next-door neighbor or our spouse or child. Moreover, I think it's not merely love, which is at the epicenter, but all virtues and all vices that are inherently linked to how we know. Gratitude has an epistemic dimension for me, because when I am full of gratitude, I am grateful, graceful, more conscious of grace, of the giftedness of life and everything in it. And it makes me smarter because I am more attentive to everything. I take things less and less for granted. So also with honesty or imagination or courage or sin. There's an epistemic dimension to all virtue and all vice. So much for navigating our tensive relationship with general authorities as moral paragons. A premise of our deliberations this weekend takes for granted that the secular world has brought us much. Also, as per Joseph Smith's emphasis in his later years, we have much to learn from all peoples, as per the 13th article of faith. Wherever that which is virtuous, lovely, or of good report is found, that includes believers outside our tradition, such as Dorothy Day or Pope Francis or Julian of Norwich, or skeptics such as Oliver Sacks, or aspects of Albert Camus or Karl Marx. Nonetheless, the loss of a sense of the transcendent is consequential. Don't let all your heroes, don't let all your exemplars or paragons be those outside those who have a keen, sensitive, developed awareness of the transcendent. The loss of the transcendent is highly consequential, but I think I'm going to skip commentary about that because more or less everybody who's been talking this weekend has touched on aspects of it. Stephen, my partner in talking through Charles Taylor and others, had an insight as we were talking. One role of exemplars, he said, may be that they offer, perhaps unawares, filtered access to the transcendent. That's because we are self-transcendent beings. And I think self-transcendence, our own nature as self-transcendent beings is one of the things that is most distinctively human about us. Jane, I didn't say that already, did I? So life happened, gooey stuff happened, paramecia happened. Somewhere along the way that got conscious, cell formations multiplied. And then life at some point developed under divine superintendency. Believers hold consciousness. That's amazing. I don't even know how you get up out of the bed in the morning and go to class without being stopped frozen by that thought. And somewhere there was an equally astounding thing that happened. From consciousness, self-transcendence happened. That is the amazing, distinctively human capacity to stand outside ourselves provisionally to some extent and contemplate ourselves. But we are self-transcendent beings, not just sitting like Rodin's thinker, but we're also self-transcendent by our capacity to try to improve. Our self-transcendence has a hot-wired direction to it. We are beckoned from somewhere to something. As King Mufasa, the deceased King Mufasa in Disney's Lion King, observed from the great beyond to his earthbound, dispirited son, Simba, you are more than you have become. Ambition, again as Stephen says, is an imperfect metaphor for this self-transcendence. In passing, since time is passing, I'll say only in passing, that we are a people in a church of order, and the virtues we most often recite to ourselves and urge ourselves toward are personal virtues for orderly time. But what does virtue look like during urgent times? To what exemplars ought Latter-day Saints turn when the times call for public resistance? Are there any such times? What if we were church members at the time of the rise of the Revolutionary War? What if the very peculiar and wrongly grounded Iraq War, by which we lost fortunes and blood and caused some, what exemplars might we look to? Should we look to Helmut Hübner, a Latter-day Saint in Nazi Germany, eventually excommunicated? On March 12th, Dr. Shi Liang from Duke University is going to come and talk to us about Zhao Lin, about his book called Blood Letters. Zhao Lin, called by prominent Chinese citizens, like one who recently wasn't able to formally accept his Nobel Prize, Zhao Lin is the last voice of freedom in China. Where do we sit looking at exemplars in relation to Martin Luther King and his letter from Birmingham jail? Most of us would admire that picturesquely from a generation later, but what, when the times are urgent, where shall we look? That's a topic for another time. As we have noted, any adoption of an exemplar for our emulation, any choice of a hero, bears an assumption or a well-thought-out philosophy or some sort of groupthink about what the end is and therefore what's good in the world, what we should aspire to. But I think it helps sometimes to change the frame of reference. Let me give two examples before I move to a conclusion. First, Joseph Smith taught, as you all know, that the fall was complex and it was kind of an elevating fall. Adam and Eve, archetypal figures representing the first humans, received contradictory commandments and had to navigate that. And Latter-day Saints tend to honor Eve, for that. The tree that is normally translated from the Hebrew, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, bears the translation from the Hebrew of a different construction. Adam and Eve partook of the tree of knowledge of good and bad. It's a Hebrew word approximating the Greek word kaka, which even my father spoke when he didn't want me to touch something. Bad. And that's a much wider concept than the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Some scholars of Hebrew, I've got a bit of a sore throat. Some scholars of Hebrew think that a looser interpretation might even bear this meaning: the tree of the knowledge of from A to Z, or the tree of knowledge of the whole ball of wax. Meaning, partaking of the fruit, the experience, the act of becoming human and encountering human experience. Joseph Smith, again, having his mind clarified in prison, in what we call section 122, was not happy, and he lamented, and he received a revelation, cast the Lord, as saying, if this crappy thing shall happen and this worse thing shall happen and your son gets separated from you by the sword and all that happens, know this, my son, that all this shall be for thy experience and thy good. Partaking of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and bad may comport with such a revelation, the tree of the knowledge of human experience. that perspective might alter what we construe as virtue. Be therefore perfect, that is, live and experience and adjudicate ambiguity and choose. Good rather than evil certainly is at the epicenter of that notion, but choose in life as a whole. Second example, Valerie Siving. I always read her, but I never pronounce her. Saving or Siving? Saving? Valerie Saving, later Goldstein, wrote back in 1960 a work that I read in the 1980s, and Deidre has drawn on her for some of her own recent work. Saving fused psychology and theology to produce this article called The Human Situation, a Feminine View. In it, she observed that whereas little girls learn that they will grow up just by waiting to be women, like their mothers, boys, who are also most typically nurtured by their mothers, learn that to be men, they must do something about it. They must separate. They must act. Mere waiting is not enough. To be a man, a boy must prove himself and go on proving himself. Because of this structural encouragement to accomplish in the world, boys become men were subject to pride. Hence, the traditional Christian analysis of the origins of sin, analysis produced by very smart men like Reinhold Niebuhr, the origins of sin in this analysis centers on pride, and the proper antidote to pride was humility and selflessness. But Saving pointed out that these traditional interpretations of sin reflect male experience in a way that does not reflect the experience of most women. Women were, she argued, much more prone to an opposite sin, that is, a missing of the mark, namely an underdevelopment or negation of the self, an inclination to triviality, a lack of focus, a dependence on others for one's self-definition, tolerance at the expense of standards of excellence. In some, Saving called for a fresh diagnosis of sin and its remedy, one that took account of the neglected half of the human race. Women needed to be encouraged rather than discouraged from asserting themselves as individuals. This sort of insight seems relevant as one considers what human models one might adopt. So, to conclude, we live in a secular world, a secular time. My own understanding of our bewildering, transforming, churning 21st century is remedial. In certain of my moods, it leaves me incredulous. But it is a crimping and dangerous thing not to work to understand. So I admire Sam and Miranda and Jim, who conceived this enterprise and who called us together. I respect you who have come to this conference and thereby added to the conference and worked to try to understand our speakers. I thank the Wheatley Institution and the Maxwell Institute for existing, for supporting what they support. To reject, to caricature, or to remain oblivious to our context in the modern world is both hubris and folly. For in doing so, we misconstrue ourselves and others. We prescribe behavior and remedy before diagnosing the malady and the promise. In that, we miss the mark. We sin. While we need better to come to terms with living when and where we do, our partially admirable secular world is also wanting. Most fundamentally, from the vantage of faith, it has spawned a spiritual neuropathy toward a transcendent divine that imagines itself as contentedly or resignedly self-contained. This sensory deprivation brings symptoms of illness as a pond with no outlet, the water grown incestuous. To be too well adjusted to a sick society is a marker neither of virtue nor of health. Our deliberations this weekend unveil new contours to the divine mandate to be in, not of, the imagined, self-contained world. Thank you. Are we out of time, or we have a minute?
We have time for 2 or 3 questions.
2 or 3 questions. Sorry to go on so long. Thank you. Please.
Just one quick comment. One of our general authorities, I've heard his wife say this on 3 different continents. I wish, it's the highest compliment I can possibly imagine. She said, as good as this man is, he's probably the best public speaker we have now. As good as he is in public, he's better than that at home. And so, in some ways, that's where the rubber meets the road. How do you treat people that sort of have to accept you no matter what?
Like the person who was receiving the apostle who was receiving the compliment.
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, I asked a question. Not as a question, but rhetorically.
Okay.
How do you, the acid test is how do you treat people that have to treat you well no matter, like your wife, your children, those people that are supposed to love you no matter what. If you're your very best self around them, there's something, that word authentic has been thrown around, but there's something really honest about that. I don't know worthy of emulation, whether it's worthy of like holding on a pedestal is a different thing. It's just that's a mark that I would do well to follow.
Yeah, good, thanks. It's not to be taken for granted, treating your family. You're supposed to have to love them, but familiarity breeds, if not contempt, casualness, and we dress up for company and sometimes treat our guests with more honor than our family. So it's not to be taken for granted. I think that's nice. And Fred.
I thought Patrick Mason a few months ago made a statement. It would be one of the most important things we could do would be to have a more robust theology about the fallibility of human leaders. And I tried to start thinking about that, and it's not that I stopped, but that I paused. And the first one I thought of, which was Moses, a man eminently worth following, but who had alienated the Lord to some degree that he was not allowed to go into the promised land. Clearly an imperfect person, but clearly somebody worth following, if you will, to the end of the earth, at least to the shore of the Jordan River.
Yeah.
Anyway, it should be easier than it seems to be culturally. Any thoughts on perhaps why it is as hard as it is to struggle with seeing these people as human beings, worth following, maybe not past the Jordan River because they haven't taken this area. Anyway, just to...
Should be easier. You voted on the wrong side in the war in heaven. It should be easier. Well, the thoughts I have, I think, are mostly those. That's what my 7 points was about. It's a tensive thing. Do I have any thoughts about why it's not easier? I think anything that involves human beings is not so easy. And I do think there are paragons there to pay careful attention to, but overdoing it, as I say, can actually backfire, put them in a terrible position, not give them a break for being humans. So it's hard because we've made it hard, partly. We've misheard follow the brethren for we should be exactly like them. When I'm called as a bishop or a Relief Society president or on the ward council or the high council or in the stake presidency, I don't think I see the Lord as, when I look at my high council, that must be the 15 most righteous people in the stake. They're authorized human beings, good human beings, vetted to some degree, subject to inspiration for their callings. And they also drip spaghetti sauce down their chins. So it's a tensive thing, follow the brethren, we're only human. But that hybrid is also pretty marvelous, I think. Thank you. You, the person who makes films.
Well, actually, I'm just going to give a quick anecdote from the first book that Dry Spray and I wrote in the trilogy about Black Pioneers. I had the line that you quoted when Joseph Smith says, "I'm not a very righteous man." Deseret Book deleted that. They did not want that to be part of the first book. I loved all of I love a man who swears as long as my arm, as long as he takes care of the poor and all of that. That was fine, but when it got time, I'm not a very righteous man, which is what he said, they nuked it. But the hagiography, I think, I would say that we have some real glimpses of hope, obviously with the essays that have come out, but for my son, who suffers from depression, and we actually have that in our family, when President Holland talked directly, in his talk like a broken vessel, about his own suffering, and made himself really human, that was a magnificent moment. I'm trying to think if we've had anything like that, where an apostle has addressed an issue that he struggles with, and has spoken with full humanity. We get sweet little anecdotes about marriage and all of that, but the hagiography is not just that we've misheard. In ways we've been misled by correlation.
Yeah, as I say, I'm glad that the church is working through that. Seems to me making improvements, but that's tough. But the impulse is virtue is better shown than jabbered about philosophically, ultimately. And so, as Jim said to one questioner in yesterday morning, let us, how did you put that? How did you put that to your questioner when he was concerned about people bearing their testimony too surely as I stand before you? And I think your response is, let us hear them more than they say. You didn't put it like that. I mung that up. It'll come back to me, Margaret. But anyway, an ethics of love, an epistemology of love, or I thought I heard you when you responded that way, Jim, operating through an epistemology of generosity to the members. So the impulse towards that hagiography, I can appreciate. I think it's backfired on us, and it's nice that we're doing better. Several other hands were up, but I think I was invited to repent of having gone too long. So sorry, I'll be around with others.